Culture is one of those things that startup founders do think about early on, but don't go deep enough, if that's the right way to put it. And so far, I haven't met any founder at any stage who felt like they built the perfect culture from day one. They might have a web page that talks about the culture, but like having that and instantiating culture in your company is completely different things. And I think it is so important because empirically, based on what I've seen in my own experience, and pretty much every founder I've talked to, you always realize that you have some cultural problem and it's always a bit too late. Doesn't mean it's not fixable, but it feels like an afterthought.
Today's episode is about defining and establishing a clear culture at an early stage startup, a topic many know about, but few actually prioritize, which backfires sooner or later. Our guest is Abhi Sharma, co-founder and CEO of Relyance AI, a startup building superintelligence for data security. To date, Relyance has raised over 60 million from the likes of Menlo, Unusual, and Microsoft's M12 venture fund. So with that, welcome Abhi. It's wonderful to have you on.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Of course. So today's topic is a super important one, startup culture. Maybe to kick things off, you told me when we last chatted that culture is one of those things you don't worry about until you find a bunch of systems that broke and you can't define why they are broken. Can you elaborate? What do you mean by that?
It's one of those things, culture is one of those things that startup founders do think about early on, but don't go deep enough, if that's the right way to put it. And so far, I haven't met any founder at any stage who felt like they built the perfect culture from day one. They might have a web page that talks about the culture, but like having that and instantiating culture in your company is completely different things. And I think it is so important because empirically, based on what I've seen in my own experience and pretty much every founder I've talked to, you always realize that you have some cultural problem and it's always a bit too late. Doesn't mean it's not fixable, but it feels like an afterthought. And having done this before as a second-time founder, I just feel that it might be a huge asset to, just like how you take the detail to build your code or your technical architecture or your go-to-market motion, if you take enough time to systematically institutionalize it early on, then it allows you to not redo systems, processes, or even product at times because you've got your cultural invariants right. And so that's what I mean by you always find out it too late. I mean, I'm pretty sure if you ask a post-IPO founder who's very successful, they will still, at least in honest private conversations, tell you, I got culture stuff to fix.
Why do you believe it's always an afterthought early on? Because people talk about it a lot, but reality looks very different.
I think it's because the transition of stuff you can monitor and control as a founder exponentially grows when you go from 10 people in the same room on the same Zoom call every day, building together. And then when that 10 goes to 15, 20, 25, 30, the amount of control and influence you have for people to operate in a certain way culturally quickly dissipates. And I think that there is a dissonance between founders knowing how much it has dissipated and what the actual reality of dissipation is. Because it's always clear in your head and you don't have time to go instrument with every person. So I think that's why it always feels like a catch-up game instead of always catch it in action. And different founders have different tricks to kind of stay on top of it. But I think that is it, like the complexity, not just of communications, but that number of brains in the pod explodes the number of ideas. And it takes a while to realize that actually I am not as much as in control of culture that I thought I was.
And with the fact that it's so hard to measure and it's so intangible, makes it even harder. Speaking of tangible, maybe to make it tangible for those listening. Right, so for you, not explicitly practicing a company culture early on, you told me backfired in 3 specific areas. Can you explain what those are for the people listening?
So when we started the company, the context, we did set some cultural pillars, right? But that is just writing down what you care about. And there's a difference between that and practicing what you wrote down, because culture is all about actions, not some all hands and quarterly decks you present to your team. It's not about what you say, it's about what you do. Now, the way it manifests in problems, I'll share three specific that it manifested for me in the early days of Reliance and even previously. Number one is hiring. So I had the great fortune of hiring a lot of people at Reliance that had worked for me for 5 or 7 years. Almost everybody came to work with me, which is fantastic. You feel very good about it. You built the relationship. You build some trust. These are people from Google, MIT, and Meta, and all great people. And so what happens is that you're in your early narrow circle of trust. And so you hire a bunch of these people. But what you do not do is, okay, I have these cultural values. So how do I measure for these cultural values in the ideal candidate profile when we're hiring them, when you go outside your circle of trust? And if you're lucky enough, your startup grows fast and you quickly realize you're now hiring from outside of your circle of trust. And all those implicit ideal candidate profile values you care about or are applicable to your company are not defined in an actionable, practical way for your team members. And then you just basically get what you get. It's a different clobbered together solution. And I think because of not being intentional about it, there was a phase at Reliance that we hired some set of people, not everybody, where it was the wrong fit. They were great people, but they're not a great fit for Reliance. So that's one example. Second one is product. So Reliance, when I started the company, we always had a platform strategy. Our mission was to build super intelligence for data security. And what that essentially meant what we would build solutions for global privacy compliance, data security, and of course with AI. I come from the AI community. And so because of that, there was this intention of what I called Act 1, Act 2, Act 3 and how we would build it. And I would talk about it. And it was like a movie with multiple acts. But again, you have to tie your product strategy to your cultural strategy, because at that time, the platform orientation, because it was not explicitly discussed, did not make into some of the technical decisions we were making. So it was a bunch, in my mind, it was going to be a seamless, waterfall of features we would build because the platform strategy was always clear. But then you thinking it's clear in your head doesn't mean it's culturally happening in the micro decisions everybody makes. And the third piece is enablement. And I think technical founders probably struggle with this the most, which is, we went from 0 to 1 really fast, like in a few months of our first beta shitty product. And at that time, again, you have to draw from your cultural pieces when you're scaling that fast, because otherwise you are subconsciously aware of doing a few things well, but they don't consciously appear in the day-to-day practices of your company. And a lot of, like, for example, the simple thing in the same way is you would then do some of the enablement by shouting from the rooftops and thinking, why don't people understand this? Instead of saying, this is very much about defining the DNA of who we are, and it borrows from the cultures, and you have to rinse and repeat that over and over a few times. And I feel like I can take those three problems, and at the end of the day, apart from tactical issues, if I really go back and say, why did I have those problems? It's not because I had the wrong idea of culture. I did not instantiate or practice those cultural values, because it would have led me and a bunch of team members to take very different actions and behavior than we did. Now, we came around to figuring it out, but like I said at the beginning, it's always a catch-up rather than staying ahead of it.
Just to make it maybe a little bit more tangible on the enablement piece, what did you have in mind and what actually happened? And why do you think right? Where did the disconnect come from?
I'll jump ahead, put the cart in front of the horse for a little bit, but you have to use this example to explain. One of our cultural values at Reliance is this idea of unreasonable hospitality, which I'll explain later, which I talked about this many times. And I explained the idea of unreasonable hospitality with a bunch of abstract examples, but we were not living it in day-to-day basis because it felt like I was shouting into the void and nothing was coming back. Then we tactically switched to story-based examples of how in a particular business deal, how in a recruiting pattern, how in a product building pattern, we lived that culture values. And I basically talked about living that value of unreasonable hospitality through small stories that had happened, and we are able to inject it. Even if in the beginning it was me injecting unreasonable hospitality, but the enablement shifted from uh, teaching you about neural nets to making you build a LLM yourself. And that is what transitions the difference in enablement. And then you also have to understand that people or sellers, especially Reliance is an enterprise B2B company, uh, people learn differently than people who build the product, who are selling them. And you have to approach the problem from their perspective, which is just learning about the problem. But this was the difference, which is enablement tends to be you repeat a few things in key moments when you have everybody in front of you and on all hands or a sales calls or sales all hands. But it's actually the practice when you're in the field, when nobody's watching, that actually has the most impact.
Now, before we get back to right what the culture DNA looks like today, and maybe to go back to that moment. So you had told me after reach a few million ARR, you sat down because again things are breaking, and you sit down and you wrote down a culture and belief systems document. And so before we go into the actual dimensions of that, right? Everyone knows at some point you have to do it, but how did you actually go about defining that and like the process that went into the sources and so on? For people listening.
I think the biggest wake up call for me was sort of when I got some of the hires wrong in our life cycle, and I reflected on it, and I realized that the reason I was getting it wrong is because I hadn't defined what were the operating principles of hiring, and that was kind of my trigger moment. And I would add this is like what founders tend to do, which they have to do a little bit, is the way you solve it is like, oh, I'm just going to do this myself because you did it from zero. So you keep telling yourself, oh, I'm going to inject myself here. I'm going to inject myself here. And suddenly you realize that at a certain scale, you can't run a business if your pinky's in every jar because you're time telling, you're not clock building. And so you're not building repeatable. So that was my trigger, the hiring piece. Now, how I went about it is I like to read personally. And so I kind of went back to my library of books I had loved or liked, but had not refreshed myself. And I did a few things. I read a few books, and the ones that are closest to my heart is pretty much everything that Jim Collins has published, but my favorite one is Good to Great. The Hard Things About Hard Things from Ben Horowitz, Crossing the Chasm, the most popular one in the Valley, Unreasonable Hospitality, which is, I think it's not on everybody's bookshelf, but it should be. And The Score Takes Care of Itself by Bill Walsh. So I kind of went back to the principles of this book and literally read each one of them cover to cover. Talked to a bunch of founders who were one or two funding stages ahead of me because your problems are a little bit futuristic you're trying to solve for. And I think the biggest thing in all of this is the last third component is a reflection time. And so I explicitly told myself that I am a founder that has a massive bias to action, but sometimes in that behavior, you also have to take time to just shut out the noise for a weekend and think about all the things you've read, your problems, and distill everything down to what is the E equal to MC square of your cultural dimension you have to define. And I think that was the biggest unlock for me. And it's the hardest to do because culturally, we just don't have this concept of reflection time. I mean, if you go back and look at even, America's history, and you read the biographies of some of the founding fathers, or any kind of like people when we made the most amount of progress in the world, or the polymaths. And there was this like idea where big people took a reflection time. They reflected about their day, and there was a sabbatical and offsite or whatever you did, right? And it was quiet. You didn't have social media. You had to go to the library, and that allowed digestion of things. And so I think that was the hardest one, but you have to do it. So those are the three things I did: talk to founders, read my favorite 5 books again, and took reflection time. And then pretty much after that, when I picked up the pen and paper, the whole thing came to me like a songwriter writing their favorite song in 5 minutes. But it was all the work that had happened for it to come out like that.
And from that point, when you wrote something down to write it actually be implemented at the company, kind of what did that process look like?
So I think when I wrote the whole thing down to every element, I had the whole thing pretty much written down over a weekend. And then the process of instantiating it was um, going over those actionable, livable values and how do you live them, and repeat that over and over and over and over again, whether it's all hands, whether it's specific team meetings. And then we did a few things, which is we created a Slack channel, which is unreasonable hospitality in the field, and people shared stories on how they were able to implement UH in their life, and then that become a kind of a channel where people always share their stories, and then just advertise this idea. But the biggest difference was it wasn't a declaration of an idea; there were examples to go with it on what it means in practice. And to be honest, like I don't think it's a exercise that ever has an end game. You're sort of in a infinite game of improvement there, where you refine, pick up new stories, refine, and just repeat and repeat. But what I'm confident about is that process led me to reach a invariant of our cultural DNA that 100 years from now, I'm very confident I will never have to change it again. It will have to be evolve in a um, like it might look and feel a little different. Like it might have a beard one day and not have a beard one day, but the DNA is not going to change.
Going through the process and especially the implementation piece of it, any kind of learnings or things you got wrong initially that you kind of iterated on over time as you did that others can learn from as well?
I think the only piece that I iterated on after I had it all written down was how to make it actionable. And that was more about being able to, because you write it down and you want to make it very actionable, and there you'll find a few holes where you're like, I think this idea is clear in my head, but how do I convince Pascal about this, and how do I give him an example? And so I think that was the only piece I really iterated on. Otherwise, everything was like pretty spot on my first draft, and has continued to stay that way.
It's been a bit since you went through that exercise. Do you still consciously carve out reflection time or kind of stepping back time for like to think about the culture and how you're doing? Or is this now just more of a like an everyday thing, just trying to live it every day, basically?
No, so I've broken it down into 3 parts, into like now revisiting it and never forgetting about it. So number one, the new process, I institutionalized it. We do now, we hire enough people that I can't do it every week, but there's a monthly new hire onboarding where I spend an hour and I walk through this myself till date. So there has been this idea of actionably expressing our culture has not been delegated to anybody, and will probably not be delegated to anybody for the longest time. So that's one, and that's how it's front and center, because every month I will go through this with all the new people we hired as a batch. Second, every quarter in our leadership offsite, there's a little bit of a carve out time to go look at that and see if this still holds, and if there are cracks here, or there are problems we are not seeing or implementing, or if there are challenges in implementing some of these cultural pieces, and what those are, where I get like input from the leadership thing. And in fact, one of my cultural values is designed to be a little at conflict with each other, and that is by design. So I want to see what comes out of that conflict. And the reflection time is baked in now in my cycle, and I think given now I'm at a place where this seems to hold. It's like I feel like I found my E equal to MC square for Reliance that can sustainably hold theoretically and practically. I kind of give myself the reflection time at a 6-year interval, a 6-month interval. So half yearly when you do our H2 planning, I will go back and look back at everything we had done and see if that I can go back and find pieces of our culture we're not living up to because of problems, or if we are doing it very well, why we're doing it very well.
All right. Speaking of culture and the different dimensions, you told me that the Reliance culture DNA consists of 5 dimensions. So invariant, hedgehog, culture and operating values, your belief system, and tactical excellence. Now, to make it tangible for those listening, I'd love to go through them with you one by one. So what do you mean by invariant?
The way I define it is all startups, I believe this to be true 100%, ultimately are about one core idea. And the journey for the founder and the startup is to distill your entire company down to that one idea and build from there. And as easy as it sounds, it is very hard to go express that idea. And it's not the feature what you do, it's not the mission, it's a DNA level element that whether things go up and down, markets go up and down, AI or tectonic shifts happen, that idea will still stay true. And it has to be almost like, as long as humans are biological creatures, they will feel hungry. And then if you like, and this is a stupid example, but it's like, it's a good texture for the invariant, which is like, yeah, this is true. Like, it's like, it's physics true. It's not opinion true, right? And so you have to find an invariant, which is the backbone of your company, that describes, we believe a particular point of view and it will always stay true. So now let me describe the invariant in context of Reliance. Reliance is a AI native platform that does privacy compliance, data security, and AI governance. Now that's the features, that's the stuff we do, but that's not my invariant. My invariant is, in the world of data security, compliance, and AI security, what people are fundamentally trying to do is resolve the gap or dissonance between their circle of visibility and their circle of controls and obligations. And whether you do it with AI or you do it with pen and paper, that invariant doesn't change. And that's the idea, which is like, it's oriented very much around either a psychological aspect of humans, a behavioral aspect of job to be done, or a invariant line or thread that will always stay true. And that's the idea of the invariant, which is like, I don't care if tomorrow we have flying cars or we are multi-planetary species. If people will care about securing and governing data, they will always have these two forces, directional vectors that are fighting with each other. You have controls and obligations and commitments, and your data and operational reality never matches that. And you're always trying to make sure you kind of balance those two sides of the equation. And the whole job is that. And so that allows me to make sure that every time we are building a product feature or thinking a product decision, we go back and we say, does this honor the invariant? And it's also very easy to describe to your team members why you exist. Like, all the product, the features, the marketing, the noise, all seems to clear the fog of, like, at the end of the day, I might build 10 features whose technical details you don't understand, but it is about, you go back to the invariant and it's like the Rosetta Stone for your company. And it always is true. That's the invariant.
Is it fair to compare it to the well-known Stripe example of increasing the GDP of the internet? And like, it doesn't matter what technology you use, right? It doesn't matter what it is. Everything has to kind of come back to that one.
Yeah, I would agree. And I feel like sometimes the invariant can get expressed in the mission or vision, but you have to be very explicit. In the case of Stripe, I think like that's the thing. It's like, we want to increase the GDP of the internet or financial infrastructure for the internet. Um, and it's like the invariant in that statement is people always will exchange something to exchange services and value between. People will use a conduit of value to exchange services. Now, that is a fundamental human behavior of how we operate as a society. That's not going to change. Like you can imagine Stripe might tomorrow become a company that only just transacts in stablecoin and all traditional payment infrastructure is dead. But they will still hold the invariant because they've anchored the company to a fundamental way of life. And it could be narrow enough to how a particular set of operators operate. Like in my case, it's domain specific to security, or it could be just how humans operate, right? And therefore, it works.
I mean, right, also does their bet on the stablecoin acquisition that they made. Then it appreciate that it's very well explained. The second dimension is Hedgehog. What do you mean by Hedgehog?
So this one is completely blatantly copied from Jim Collins. So all the credit really goes to Jim Collins and on all the researchers who worked with him on that. So it's the concept borrowed from the book Good to Great. And the simple idea of hedgehog is you need to have the hedgehog concept is basically you need to have a shield like a hedgehog that protects you and differentiates you no matter what the weather or environment is, because that will always hold and it builds on that invariant that it's kind of like your superpower. And you can in simple ways you could say, what's my superpower? So the hedgehog, according to that book, breaks down into three components. The one thing you can always be exceptional at, and it's not like you are, but you believe you can be. So you might be on the journey to be exceptional at that, but it's the one thing you can be really, really good at. Second is, what is your core economic driver? And the third thing is how do you differentiate in your passion and culture, or what is the why do you want to build it, or what is the authentic texture of you, the founders and the company that adds a catalyst to all of this, your uniqueness, if you will, or your personality. And I think the third one is very specific to each company and each founder. So I'll not touch too much about that because this like I can't define, like if Pascal starts a company tomorrow, he has to define the culture. I can't define it for him, right? But the first two are like very clear and it actually have a very good way of thinking about it, which is it goes back to the invariant, which is like it's the one thing that you believe you can do better than anybody else because of either the way you view the world, your product or technology architecture, your specific skill set, your point of view of the invariant, that you can bring something to bear. And it might not be 100% great just yet, but because of an accumulating advantage layer of where you started, you can just do this exceptionally well. So in my case at Reliance, the idea was data journeys or contextual end-to-end data flow and lineage. Because nobody until we started in the world had stitched or had the ability to autonomously track the flow of data from code to runtime to AI to third parties. People had pieces of the visibility, but there wasn't a single thread that went through all those needles. And so now that became my superpower, and I could just keep infinitely digging that hole and making it better and better and better. So you're an infinite loop of refinement. So ultimately, you need something in your company that is like that one concept. And sometimes it's very hidden or internal to you, but you need one. And that's your a one thing you're exceptional of. And second thing is you got to figure out what your core economic driver is. And people always confuse this with pricing and packaging. And that's not what the economic driver is. You have to tie it back to the behavior of the invariant and figure out what the economic driver is. And I think instead of me regurgitating, for everybody in the audience listening, Jim Collins' book has a ton of very concrete examples, all the way from old companies to Walmart and CVS, and what their economic driver was. And it's basically, how do you make profits on an fundamental element that allows you to scale that up infinitely or incrementally or non-linearly. And so that's the idea of core economic driver. So in the case of Reliance, I can explain it as people think it's like um, the confusion part is what I can really talk about, which is people confuse this with pricing and packaging, and that's not like your economic driver is not that Pascal. I'm going to ship. I charge $10 for one burger. If I make 1 million burgers, I make 1 million into $10, right? It's not that. My economic driver is maybe how many times Pascal will come and revisit and have more of my burgers. And so, that's the distinction, because then you optimize for a very different experience, because my optimization is your revisits, not how much I charge you for one burger. And then, like, for example, I think CBS or something, I forget whose example was, it was they re-architected to, therefore how the shelving concept came along and how they put things together, because the optimization for CVS, and I might be getting the company wrong, but let's just go with CVS for now. Their economic driver was profit per visit. How much money can I make from Pascal coming to my store and the visit? And how can I make visits convenient? And therefore, you can sometimes find the 3 CVS stores 4 blocks away, and you're like, why the hell there's so many CVS stores here? And it's because they're trying to maximize the profit per visit, not the profit per transaction. And it's a multi-visit economic driver. And so it takes a while for you to find yours. And that's the second piece of the Hedgehog concept. And there's the passion and culture piece, but like I think those two are the most important. And I defined that for myself. So for Reliance, that was profit per change in data processing. And what that meant was like, if you look at a company, so we are in the world of privacy, security, AI governance. When does risk arise? So if you assume stable state, because you like tangible examples, if a company stays stable and does nothing, no code is checked in, no transactions happen, no third parties get onboarded, then you have a static view of risk. Risk arises or problems arise when change happens. So if I can tie Reliance's economic driver to how much profit can I make when a change happens in data processing, then you build features, because the wave I'm riding is the delta, the git diff of data change. And so then you can build a ton of features. And Stripe is a good example to go back to, because it's like they started with payment processing, but the core economic driver was different. So now you have a slew of products, because your economic driver is not how much I might commission I'm charging on each transaction. Then you stay in a certain lane.
Understanding that then translates into how you price, and ideally, right? There's a concept that I read a while ago from Jesse from IA Ventures that talked about dominance friction. Like one of the ways they look at startups through that really resonated is like how much friction is there between a startup's business model and the product and the value that it actually delivers to customers, right? And the more you can align your own business model and economic model to the value that customers create or get from you, obviously the less likely you are to be disrupted by somebody else figuring out a better alignment there. And which goes back to why perceived pricing is a horrible model, because you're incentivized to sell more seats, even though the marginal value per additional seat may actually be diminishing as you have more seats for every company.
Yep. And you're right. Like that's kind of the idea where it gets confused for pricing and packaging, but it's not that. It's the orientation. And now I remember, as we were talking, is the example I misspoke. It was Walgreens and not CVS. Walgreens was, but the same idea.
Same business. Yeah. Last question on the Hedgehog. I'm assuming to put that into practice, it's less living it and it takes a lot more education versus maybe some of the other dimensions. How do you implement this at a company?
I think the easiest thing, in our case, the one thing we are really unique as ended up being easy. Easy because we chose to do it that way, which was that unique differentiator is one of the direct features in in our product. So like the whole product is built on one core feature called data journey. So you kind of have to have that portion. So that's the easiest, because then if like, you know, if your thing, one thing you can be really good at also becomes the feature that you sell as part of your product, but you have to make sure that the thing is a broader thing. Sometimes it could be one feature, but it cannot be like one piece of functionality. Sometimes it matches. In our case, it kind of roughly matched, so that worked. So then it just is obvious, because if like, how am I going deeper into one thing I'm better at? Is I'm doing that feature and or that functionality, and I just have to keep improving it. So that already puts in a self-fulfilling loop, if you will. And then the second part of the economic driver, I think the best tactical tip is you that I found is, once you describe what your economic driver is, then you think in terms of the next layer up is what you will produce, and then how you will price. So the best tactical example I'll give you is, I think Costco's economic driver is profit per square foot, right? Because they're large stores, they sell in wholesale. So, and they have to fight on the margins, right? So Costco's economic driver is not um, profit on the products you buy, is how much profit can I squeeze out of per square foot that I have. And that's why whenever, I think everybody can say for sure, they went to Costco to buy toilet paper and they came back with 50 things. Everybody has experienced this. It happens to, and the reason is the optimization function is maximizing inventory and foot traffic per square foot.
Yeah.
And that's the reason this happens. So what happens if we use the same analogy I say is, you figure out what your economic driver is, then you build your product, and therefore you might get informed by what product to build. And then you price accordingly. That goes deep way into it. So if you look at it, it's almost like though delusional. Costco prices their product very cheaply, or at least wholesale prices their pitch, right? So if I just look at the price, I would not understand their economic driver, because I would be like, yeah, you're like, everybody else charges $10 for this toilet paper, you're charging 8. So you're reducing price. But what you don't realize is they're then adding multiple products and they're implementing a life cycle of experience that causes more value to be derived in your foot time and traffic per square foot. And that is how you compete. So sometimes your economic driver and your pricing model might seem orthogonal, but they drive more volume. Like, I think Shopify is also a good example. Like, Toby has done this really well, where they actually, like, and he even talks about it, which is um, they have a pricing advantage where they can actually uh, set a price, and he's always chosen to be low price on the margins that Shopify charges, because he wants more volume to flow through the system, and you still make more money that way, and more profits that way. And it's actually very counterintuitive, because if you follow any traditional Wall Street VC advice, you're like, oh, you're in like the same situation, and Nvidia is like, go charge more for your GPUs because everybody wants them. But and sometimes it's the right thing to do, but like, you really have to think about the entire arc. And so that's like a good example of how to think about the economic driver.
Yeah, and it's like great listening to you and reflecting on it. Way too few startups, especially early on the truly understand what their economic driver is. And they just read a bunch of things and put a price tag on it and then kind of try to sell that one.
And this is one where I confidently feel that it is perfectly okay if it takes a while for you to figure out. And you might figure this out in an iterative fashion. It took me 3 years to really figure out, even though we were selling profit and we started making money as a business. And that's okay. Like, but being comfortable to live in the uncomfortableness to figure out your economic driver is the thing to kind of take away from there, but keep digging at it. I think what ends up happening is, if companies find some traction, you offload this problem to your sales leader, which is also a flaw, or you just don't think about it for a long periods of time, and sometimes you're lucky enough and people subconsciously discover it, but they don't know how to articulate it. And I feel like if you're that 1% lucky companies, like good for you. But for most people, things have to be built with grunt and force and sweat and tears. So being explicit is probably a better probability for success.
To move on to the next one, right? The third dimension is culture and operating values, which can mean everything and nothing. And you also say this out, right? Culture is actions, not words. What do you mean by that, and how did that impact the 6 dimensions that you ultimately chose on the culture and operating values?
For me, the culture and operating values go together. And it is pretty much the design of the blueprint for culture and operating values is this idea. This culture is actions, not words. And so what that essentially means is you define your cultural values. There could be 3, 4, 5, 6. We have 6 at Reliance. And I'm happy to talk about them if you care to. But like we define those. And then the operating value is, so you have a cultural statement or a cultural value, and then you have an operating blueprint tied with it. And and the harder part for most founders is not defining the cultural values, but defining explicitly the operating blueprint underneath it with examples, texture, focus, and doing it in a way that it's applicable to your business, right? Like I'm in the business of building super intelligence for data security. I cannot borrow Amazon's retail operating values. But what ends up happening is founders love Jeff Bezos or some of them, and they like his ideas, and then they tweak it and copy paste in there. And that's not bad, by the way, to be inspired, but you kind of have to let it flow through your system and have to authentically make it yours. And so I feel like I did a good job early on picking those cultural values, but where I did not, where I have like, now I don't give myself a C minus, but in that period, I'd give myself C minus because I wrote the culture, had little ways of describing it, but the operating values weren't clear. And so that's the piece of like what operating structure means to each of those cultural values. And you have to give examples on what that essentially means. What does and I can pick one out of our 6 cultural values if you care to know on how to describe this.
Yeah, that'd be awesome. If you can elaborate, like make it more tangible.
I'll pick on one. So let me first just lay out for people who are listening the 6 cultural values and operating principles for Reliance are: number 1, unreasonable hospitality and amp it up; 2nd, team first; 3rd, critical thinking; 4th, persistence; 5th, trust; 6th, global impact.
It's interesting because if you listen to it, these sound very generic. And so, like when we last spoke, you told this to me, like a lot of people stop at that place, and then it means everything and nothing. So I guess the operating blueprint below it is what
Exactly,
really
because
matters.
you could I 100% agree with you, because you could go pick the top word or key phrase for every company's cultural value, and people say customer first, or you know, be trustworthy, or enjoy what you're doing. Or people have all kinds of like. There's a lot of repetition in this because it's inspired by different founders looking at each other, and like you said, it's very abstract. But then it's the operating principle beneath it that makes a ton of the difference. So I'm going to pick one which is the most abstract just to make my and drive my point home, right? So let's pick trust. Now, if I use that word, like the basis point is like that means nothing and everything at the same time. What does it mean for you, right? So I'll first start with why did I pick trust? Because when I thought about it, this is something that I really care about. Number 1, so the first thing was like being a trustworthy person, operating with trust, having a high ethical value is core to who I am. My parents were educators who were very poor. So the whole thing of my upbringing is around trust. So it was personally an important value. So that's high level abstract. Second, we are in the business of building, again, super intelligence for data security. If we do our job right, where Essence is essentially selling trust as a service. So that's why that was important. So now the high level personal attachment to contextual for business, like, does it make sense? Yeah, people have to trust us. Security, it's all about trust. So therefore, it applies to my business, because I could care about like something deeply personally, but if it doesn't apply to my business, there's no point picking it. So that's the second layer of figuring out. And now, what does trust mean as an abstract concept? So we picked three things, and for every culture value, you have three operating principles. And some are internal facing, because the design of the operating principles underneath that culture value is specific guidance on how to feel and behave both internally and externally, because those are your two directional vectors: internally within the company, external with the world. So the one was, okay, trust. Three operating principles under trust. First, believe in the Stockdale Paradox. Now, what is the Stockdale Paradox? There's a Army or Navy general here in the United States. His name was, I think John Stockdale. I might be getting his first name wrong. And Stockdale's paradox was, in the world of military and army, you have to have these two opposing ideas together. And this is, you have to fully acknowledge the absolute shit show of your situation and the dire circumstance, while at this, and being totally brutally honest about it, while at the same time being fully confident that I'm going to figure out a way. And so under trust, the operating guidance to the team is, you have to live Stockdale's paradox every day. Because what will happen is, and so how does it change, how does it manifest, is things always go wrong at startups. You hire people and sometimes has mistrust between people. As you scale, politics starts to happen. And it allows me to say, no, you have to assume good intent. You have to be open about problems, but also believe we're one team, all in, all together. Also, sometimes bad things might happen at the company, that they always do. You still have to have Stockdale Paradox. So now they have a story and something contextual to go back. And then what I'll do is, you'll take that and you say, hey, look, team, today is the all hands in second all hands of August. Here's how we practice Stockdale Paradox. Here's three stories from the last 2 weeks, which could be customer deal, could be an internal product broken, could be two people fighting, but we then came together or something, right? So that's one.
Right, having this framework also allows me as an individual, if I'm in this situation, to go back and say, hey, I've only considered, right, I haven't considered all the dimensions that I'm supposed to consider. So let me actually, right, I completely, because I'm so frustrated, I didn't think about good intentions. So let me, like, what could be good intentions? Let me make sure that I don't skip over those. So that makes a lot of sense.
So that's one component. So under trust, the first component is Stockdale Paradox. Second component, and as you can see, this idea enables trust in very tangible ways, right? It could be like, hey, we had a bad quarter, or this product didn't ship on time, and everybody's freaked out. So you have to acknowledge the bad, but say, hey, we're going to still win, right? And that holds the whole thing together and shows in their behavior. The second component is this idea of job versus responsibility. And this one is also borrowed, I can't remember from where, but all of my readings. And this one is even more tactical. And the way I express it is, so our cultural value is trust. How do you live that cultural value? You care about responsibility, not just your job. What does this mean? A surgeon's job is to perform the procedure. Her responsibility is a great health outcome for Pascal. A teacher's job is to teach, let's call it algebra in the class. The teacher's responsibility is a sound mathematical mind of the student. A coach's job is to make sure he or she takes Pascal through his exercise and drills. But a coach's responsibility is to make Pascal a great athlete. And as you can see, there's a huge difference and ownership when you think of this way. And then I say, you project trust internally or externally when you choose to take responsibility, not just to do your job. So, like, a great operating blueprint on trust.
One of the discussions I have a lot with the founders in our portfolio is, right, how do you make sure your employees don't show up to work as employees but as owners? And like, this is it's the same thing, just like a different framing of it, the job versus responsibility. Because job is, you're an employee and you just do your work, or with your to-do list, and responsibility is obviously, right, you own part of this business and you're responsible for the outcome.
One of our John Brianos is a VC on my board. at Unusual Ventures, and his way of saying is like, which is a little bit more, I guess, uh, outcome oriented or lagging indicator oriented, which is like you don't get credit for getting 80% to the moon. You only get credit to get to the moon, which is the same idea, but said differently. And the third component of, again, trust is, again, a very behavioral oriented discussion, and it goes like this: good news fast, bad news faster. And this is the idea, which is internally, externally, stuff will always be up and down, and we want to live by this. If it this good news, it needs to travel fast. Bad news needs to travel faster. Because if we can do that, which means you have trust in the system. So this is almost a behavioral instrumentation test for trust. And so every cultural value is then broken down into 3 directives like this, which you can practice, and then you share stories to reinforce that. So that's the framework.
Maybe a follow-up question on the good news versus bad news, right? There's always a threshold around at what point is bad news important enough to surface it, right? Which has a huge impact on perceived speed. Like, what are, in your company specifically, how do you go about that one and kind of teach people at what level of relevancy is it actually important for bad news to travel very fast?
Yeah. So the way I do it is, what happens is, when you're small enough, like you're like pre-series A or something, it happens organically. And then you realize you grow after that stage, and it's the one thing that seemed to really happen organically and just stops happening because you build people hierarchies and layers, and suddenly everybody's afraid and protecting their territories, and bad news stops traveling fast enough. And the problem is, if it travels slow, you can't fix it. So far, the only thing I have found is you allow the room for the bad news to travel, and don't necessarily reprimand because the news traveling is bad, and take the time to kind of go and digest it and understand. The other one that we've tried to do at Reliance is, we said, the word escalate has a bad connotation, and we say that we don't think it's a bad connotation. Like, think of the word escalate is increasing the urgency and priority to increase a bias of action, rather than the negative connotation that the word brings. And so you have to like just repeat that and try to help people rewire their brains. And so that's what we say. We say, hey, escalate's not a bad word. Escalate. And you can definitely get into bad habits because of that too, because then nobody's like doing their stuff and thinking it out and only escalating. But I feel like the reason why it works is, for the longest time, everybody's trained for escalate to be a bad thing. So when you say suddenly escalate is a good thing, they don't go back to zero. People go back to somewhere in the median, and that's how you find the balance. That's why, to give you an example, one of our cultural values is unreasonable hospitality. Because if you can do unreasonable hospitality and you do reasonable hospitality, that's still a pretty good place to land at scale. So that's the idea of how you still balance the balance in there between bad news faster.
And I think, right, in combination with the responsibility piece, where people take ownership, the escalation actually works because they take responsibility for the outcome. Now I want to move on to the fourth one, of your overall, not just culture and operating values, but the fourth overarching dimension, which is your belief system. What is part of that, and what do you mean by belief system?
Yeah, so the way I thought about it is, if your cultural values in your operating system is like the cake, the belief system is the cherry on top, that somehow just, or like a beautiful gift that just wrapped perfectly. And that's how I think about the belief system, which is, okay, you have 6 cultural values, there are 3 operating principles in each. That's a whole lot of things. The belief system is a bit that just ties it all together, which are just a few point of view statements. In this case, I've picked 3 because it's like I have everything in prime, so that seemed to fit. So I had like 3 statements, which is like, here's what we fundamentally believe, and if you believe the same things, then you will appreciate and like our cultural values and operating systems, principles. And if you don't, then you probably aren't a good fit. And it kind of just ties the whole thing together and makes it into like something you could put on a sticker and slap on the banner and all of that. And for me, it's basically three things. Excellence is a choice. And this general idea is greatness is never a function of circumstance. It is mostly limited by self constraints or laziness. So, excellence is mostly a part of conscious choice. Success comes in cans and failure comes in cannots. And then the final thing is like there's nobody behind the curtain. And so these are like my three higher level belief systems. And if you dig into that deeply and you say, okay, what does that actually mean? It is an homage to a lot of my culture values and operating principles, or a catalyst that adds and blooms that cultural value a little bit more deeply, right? So, for example, since just to correlate, there's nobody behind the curtain, which means you're it and you have to take responsibility and go do your stuff. So it ties back to the idea of trust, because if you have that, you have the responsibility and you'll care. Or one of my top culture, the first one is unreasonable hospitality. And then we define that one of those things is how do you showcase unreasonable hospitality is that it's broken down into you have to have care, you have to have curation, you have to have connection. And the care is like you anticipate a need before it's voiced. Curation is you feel that the touch point is handpicked for me, and connection is that moment changed how I think and act. And so that's the magic trick. That's the three part of the prestige magic trick, if you will. And so if you look at care, curation, connection, and then tie it back to belief, like there's nobody behind the curtain, then well, if I don't have to wait for ceremony and I don't have to wait for some kind of approval to go do this, then I have to go handpick that experience for my customer or for my colleague. So the belief system is like the glue that holds this together and nicely ties it in a bow. And then I will take the belief system and get it back. And then it's also, I mean, it's also a great tactical trick. You can make stickers out of it. You can put it on the, like on our office in San Francisco. On as you enter the office, there's a big giant wall in the back, and it says "Success comes in cans, failure comes in canals." And it's just like right there, because it's hard
Nice.
to print the entire cultural sheet.
Of course.
So this is what kind of is a cheat code for what we mean by culture and operating principles.
Last one is tactical excellence, which again, right, can mean everything. How do you go about that at Reliance?
This one is important, and I think I'm glad you asked about this, because there's a dissonance between the two ideas. Because, okay, culture, operating principles, belief systems. I gave you some examples, but good, but still in the realm of inspiration, abstract ideas and ways to behave, right? Like it's not telling you that Pascal, it's culture, operating principles, and belief system is telling you, Pascal, you should care about the idea of copy and paste, but it's not giving you control C, control V. So the tactical excellence is control C, control V of taking that and what does it mean to control C, control V. And it's designed to build a drivetrain on how to do five, six things consistently. And it's orthogonal and applicable to all departments. And so the way I define it is like, okay, and it's basically a blueprint of how do you operate day to day, and it's more oriented around your job, and it's a tactical framework. So, for example, the six pillars I have under operational excellence is hiring, culture steeping, training, OKRs and BHAGs, telemetry, and appreciation, right? And so, obviously, we don't have time to go through everything, but for example, under culture steeping, we then have the same idea, which is Abhi will do the vision deck no matter how many times it happens every month. So that's a tactical action somebody can take. Then we'll say, okay, we will have a monthly newsletter called the Roar, because we are lions, mailed to all of the employees. And we will physically send you the newsletter in a mail as if you got it from a magazine, right? And
Yes.
and like it to be like, okay, now you start a practice. So the operational excellence blueprint is about rhythm and rituals that you will do, which is uniquely to you. You just send that newsletter in the mail, and like just like you get New York Times or whatever magazine you like, it just shows up like that. And it's like unique and different, right? Or we say, okay, in every monthly all hands for all departments, thou shall do these 4 things. And those are part of everybody's things. So this is my recipe for culture steeping, because I can talk about culture every all hands, but still not tangible enough. Then you have to reinforce in day-to-day activities. And that's the, it's like if I have to keep going back to my cake analogy, it's like you have to bake a great cake, for sure there's a cherry on top, and then you give them a guidance on how to eat it. And so the operational excellence is how do you eat it over and over again.
Just quickly, if I'm an individual who joins Reliance, how do these get defined for me? And like at what point, and kind of how often like what's the very tactical kind of cornerstones of how you actually implement that with a process around it?
So first of all, as a founder and CEO, you repeat this in your all hands. And you can go through everything all the time, but you pick one corner and you double click and you go in a repeat cycle. Like I think one of the most underrated things of getting this right is you just repeat it, and people forget how many times they don't repeat it. So that's that. And then you have to make sure your first line of leadership and the line before that really understand this, so they can be the torch bearers for you, because there's going to be so many micro decisions that you cannot make, but they have to continue to make for you. And the third thing, after a certain scale, which is the most hardest, from time to time you have to take your hand as a founder and put it into the jar of that department and touch pieces you have not touched in a while, as a casual introspection, casual inspection, and you realize if it has seeped enough or not, and you'll find a way to kind of like double click on it. And the third part is something that this is what I think became popular recently when Brian Chesky talked about founder mode. That's what it is. So the tactical operational excellence, you have to let's call it exercise founder mode from time to time, even if you're not doing it in like every micro decision. And there's a balance between micromanagement and founder mode, and I don't think the world has really figured out how to empirically distinguish them. But that's what it is. That's how you test for it.
Just, I guess, one more quick follow-up question on the actual tactical excellence, right? Because you said one of your dimensions here is hiring. Now, if I'm an employee in Reliance, who defines what my 5, 3, 4, 5, 6 cornerstones are of tactical excellence? So I have actually something that applies to me.
In this particular case, we have even defined that narrowly. So like I'll take the hiring, and we have this thing called the 555 funnel. And the idea is like in our process of interviewing, we're going to have 5 culture value tests, 5 superpower tests, 5 reference checks, hot and cold. And that everybody has to follow that. And then you have some liberty for that department or that person to go tweak a few things on there, because you do also want to like carry the stuff that they bring to the table that's uniquely them and good, and add to the pot. But like it's a little bit like paint by numbers. You have to put the scaffolding, and then they can decide if it's orange or green in this box.
It's partially top down, and it's partially right. They can decide themselves how they want to implement that.
Paint by numbers is like my best analogy. Is like you want to have the book, you want to make sure the characters and the scaffolding is clear, and then you say, here's a box of crayons. Like you can color it purple, blue, orange, whatever pleases you. Go have at it.
I want to take a quick step back. Right, you went through this. You have a very good idea of what your culture is. What were some of the major learnings from this process if you had to advise a founder by just going through this and everything's breaking and wants to do the same thing as you do?
I'd say the biggest learning is just be explicit about this, because you may not get everything right the first time. You may not always have it precisely defined, but the intention of being just very, very explicit allows you to get to a point that is not a degenerate case of not doing anything. And I think, for example, and the most intimately the way it will feel is like I look back and, in a moment of very openness, I look at Reliance and I say, okay, we're this business, we've grown so much. And if I ask myself, hey, if I am at, I'll make this very tangible, although this is not the only metric for success, but that's how the world thinks about it. So let's use it. If I go back and ask myself, hey, I'm at X million ARR today, why am I not X plus Y millennial? Right. And I go back, and you could always you can only do this in hindsight, but you can point it down to one or two things that led to that. And you'll realize, if you dig enough why, it will go back to something cultural. Um, so for me, for example, we had this massive phase of growth, and then we hire, some executive and some other people. We did hire some bad people, so it took us some time to get over that hump. And I was like, okay, am I a bad manager? Am I a bad hire? Well, that doesn't add up. Like, I've had a good exit with a startup, and everybody came to work for me. So that might be not it. What did it come down to? I didn't define the culture of hiring. And even I became oblivious to not being explicit about it. And, and then what ends up happening is, if things go wrong, you have to be accountable for that. Like, the famous saying, success has many fathers while failure only has one. And that's what ends up happening.
To close it with just three quick questions that I'll have to ask you. First one is, what popular advice that is often given to startup founders and operators do you disagree with, and why?
I think the most common advice that is given by people is, hire certain kinds of executives and then kind of step off the way and let them kind of run it. And you're not good at that, or you're not good at that. You don't understand this piece. And I feel like that is always not true. And I think there's a fine line between, you want to learn certain things from people you're not fundamentally good at, but at the same time, you can never ignore sort of your gut and instinct. And I think that, in my opinion, over a long period of time, that always trumps. And so I would say that people usually say, don't trust your instinct or gut when you're early and you don't know how to do go to market or marketing or whatever. And I would go back and say, trust your gut, because this is the team, and this is what you have that got started it. And you don't have to have ego attached with it. So learn to iterate, but you have to trust your gut. And I think wherever I have not, I feel like I've made a bad decision, which would have been different if I just trusted my gut. So that's what I would say. And therefore, I think I very much agree with the founder mode advice from Brian Chesky, because you just realize that you would not have taken those decisions if you were really listening to your gut and instinct. It's like, I think to make this tangible for everybody, it's like, I think it's called the mother's instinct. Like, the doctors might say a lot, but your mom really knows what's wrong with the baby, and it's always true.
Yeah, yeah, that's a great analogy. Now, to turn this around, right? For someone who is thinking about starting a company or has just started one, what's the one piece of advice you have for them?
I would say that if you are not all in, or you're not sure about it, like, don't do it. It is a like, I think, and it's very hard to do this, especially in times when you're good at a few things and you feel like this seems like a good idea. I think starting a business for any sake of vanity is 100% a recipe for disaster. And it is very hard to tell yourself and be very honest with yourself. So my piece of advice is that, be exceptionally honest with yourself on why you're doing this, and take that extra time to do reflections. I think nobody does that in the pace and velocity. And you can always go find somebody who can give you more advice. But I think at a certain size and scale, you need to learn how to go inwards and not just outwards. And it's very hard to do. So that would be my advice: is put a ritual in place where you go inwards instead of just going outwards. It's like almost like, you like, if you're religious, if you went to every single temple in the world, but you never like looked inside, which is where you really would find God. And I think that's the advice.
Yeah, that's you definitely have great analogies. That's a fantastic one. Too many founders, unfortunately, also see availability of capital for their idea as a validation that they need, and it often isn't, because we investors, we're making bets on the future, but we have no idea if that's actually a good idea or if it's going to work out or not. The last question that I have for you, just because I'm always curious as a VC myself, what's the most impactful thing investors have done for you, can do for you, in any business you've been involved with today?
Yeah, I mean, I would say, and no offense, like, usually I'm very much one of those founders that, like, VCs don't add that much value into building the companies apart from capital. But I do think there are a few good ones. And for me personally, it has been the coaching to stay very true to really go find product market fit. And I think it really stuck with me. And since you like concrete examples, the way I manifested it in my business is when I started Reliance, and we had some great VCs like Unusual Ventures, Menlo Ventures, like good brand names, right? And one of the explicit decisions because of that coaching that I got, I said the first 5 deals at the company, I want no introductions, no soft introduction, no open doors, no cozy dinners, no nudge. I'm going to go find my first customers myself because that's when I know there is something there, there's enough pain, and I can go build something that people want. And I think that has been magical advice, as painful and as hard it is, and as if I mean, all analogies that founders say about how hard it is to build a company are 100% true. But I think this is a great advice, which is like, it's going to be very painful. And I took it to heart, and I like literally did this. So the first 5 deals that we did at Reliance, none of my VCs help, and by design. Of course, you get help later for sure. As you scale, you need all that. But like the original one, and I think that's great advice actually, because and the reason I say this is topical, Pascal, is because like we're like right now, it's very topical. You live in the world of AI. If you're an early stage company and there's a strong AI story, most VCs don't know where the terminal accrual of value will happen in this new tectonic shift. So you can raise a lot of capital quite quickly if you have a good story and you have credibility. But does that mean, do you hack your way into a few million in ARR, or do you really try to iteratively loop and go through that arduous process to find true product market fit? And I think it's the latter. That's what we really need to do, but nobody will advise doing this. The second thing I would say, it's not thoughtful advice, but impactful. The other piece, which is like, I think it's very helpful for founders, or if they can find stable and predictable VCs, because board management is a thing, and I think that VCs are also getting market signals from their friend and all of that, and I think it's better to have VCs who have their own thesis, because it goes a long way in building together, because it's hard no matter how you do it.
No, 100%. Right. That and also in recent months, there's been a lot of churn of individuals, venture firms, and so on, which is obviously not helping founders either. This is a great place to end. This was absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much. And I really appreciate you coming on.
Yeah, thank you for having me.